The sun dipped below the horizon, casting an eerie glow over the decrepit remains of Black Ridge Asylum. Once a place of healing, or so it was intended, the asylum had long since been abandoned, left to decay in the remote wilderness. The walls, now crumbling and overgrown with ivy, bore witness to the horrors that had unfolded within. Unseen eyes seemed to watch from the shattered windows, as if the building itself was alive, waiting for something or someone to return. Agent Victor Hayes, the leader of a secret government paranormal investigation team, stood at the entrance, the weight of the asylum's dark history pressing down on him. His team, a ragtag group of skeptics, scientists, and soldiers, were handpicked for their expertise in the unknown. But even they couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that gripped them as they approached the building. The air was thick with a palpable sense of dread, and the distant sound of whispering voices drifted through the wind, sending chills down their spines. As they stepped inside, the temperature dropped abruptly, and the oppressive silence was broken only by the creaking of the old wooden floors beneath their feet. Agent Hayes flicked on his flashlight, the beam cutting through the thick darkness that seemed to swallow everything around them. The walls were lined with faded, peeling wallpaper, stained with dark, unidentifiable substances. The scent of mildew and rot was overwhelming, mixing with something else, something metallic, like blood. "Stay close," Hayes whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding of his own heart. He could feel the weight of countless unseen eyes on them, as if the very walls were watching, waiting. They moved cautiously through the corridors, their footsteps echoing unnaturally in the vast, empty spaces. Suddenly, a cold breeze blew through the hallway, extinguishing their flashlights in an instant. Panic gripped the team as they fumbled in the dark, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. A scream tore through the silence, freezing them in place. It was a sound of pure, unbridled terror, one that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "What the hell was that?" One of the team members, Lisa, gasped, her voice trembling. "Keep moving," Hayes ordered, though his own fear was barely contained. They pushed forward, the oppressive darkness closing in around them. The whispers now sounded like voices, many voices, pleading, crying, laughing maniacally. The asylum was alive with the memories of those who had suffered here, their pain etched into the very fabric of the building. Then, without warning, the floor beneath them gave way. They plunged into the abyss, the darkness swallowing their screams. Hayes hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind out of him. Dazed, he looked around and found himself alone in a pitch-black room. The only sound was the echo of his own breathing, and somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of footsteps approaching, slow, deliberate, and impossibly heavy. Someone or something was coming. Agent Hayes scrambled to his feet, his heart racing as the footsteps grew closer. The air in the room was thick with dust and the scent of decay, making it difficult to breathe. He fumbled for his flashlight, his hands shaking, but when he flicked it on, the beam revealed nothing but darkness. The walls seemed to close in on him, the oppressive atmosphere making it hard to think clearly. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing off the unseen walls. But there was no response, only the sound of the footsteps growing nearer. They were slow, deliberate, and filled with a menace that made his skin crawl. Hayes forced himself to move, pushing through the darkness with only his flashlight to guide him. The room felt like it was shifting, the walls seeming to pulse and breathe, as if the building itself were alive. The whispers that had haunted them earlier were now louder, more distinct. He could almost make out words, but they were garbled, twisted into something inhuman. Suddenly, his flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The walls were covered in writing, hundreds, maybe thousands, of messages scrawled in what looked like blood. Words of madness, despair, and pain, written over and over until they became an unintelligible mass of horror. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the writing vanished, leaving only the cold, bare walls in its place. The footsteps stopped. Hayes froze, his breath catching in his throat. The silence was deafening, the kind that presses in on all sides and makes the air feel thick and heavy. He felt a presence behind him, close, too close. Slowly he turned, the beam of his flashlight sweeping across the room. Nothing, and yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something was there, just out of sight, waiting for him to let his guard down. He backed up, his eyes darting around the room, searching for any sign of movement. The whispers began again, but this time they were different, more urgent, more desperate. They seemed to be coming from the walls themselves, as if the building was trying to communicate with him. Just as he was about to turn and run, something cold brushed against his arm. He yelped and swung the flashlight around, but there was nothing there. His mind was racing, fear clawing at the edges of his sanity. He had faced down all manner of horrors in his line of work. But this was something else. This was a place of pure, concentrated evil, and it was toying with him. He had to get out. Now, Hayes turned and bolted for the door, his footsteps echoing loudly in the oppressive silence. But the door wouldn't budge. He slammed his shoulder against it, but it was as if the door had become part of the wall, immovable and unyielding. Panic surged through him, and he pounded on the door, shouting for help, but his voice was swallowed by the darkness. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the whispers stopped. The room was plunged into an unnatural silence, one that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. And in that silence, he heard a voice, a single clear voice that cut through the darkness like a knife. "Welcome back, Victor." The voice was familiar, chillingly so. It was a voice he hadn't heard in years. A voice that shouldn't be here, that couldn't be here. Because the man it belonged to was dead. Hayes staggered back from the door, the blood draining from his face. The voice echoed in his mind, a ghostly reminder of a past he had tried to forget. His heart pounded in his chest as he tried to rationalize what he had just heard. But there was no mistaking it. The voice belonged to Dr. Daniel Mercer, the former head of Black Ridge Asylum, Hayes's mentor, and the man who had died in a fire here 20 years ago. How is this possible? Hayes whispered, his voice trembling. His flashlight flickered again, casting eerie shadows across the room. The walls seemed to close in on him, the oppressive atmosphere making it hard to breathe. He had to get out of here, now. He turned and ran, his footsteps echoing in the darkness as he made his way through the labyrinthine halls of the asylum. The whispers followed him, growing louder with each step, until they were a deafening chorus of voices all screaming in unison. The walls seemed to pulse and breathe, as if the building itself was alive and hungry. Suddenly, the floor gave way beneath him, and Hayes tumbled down a steep staircase, landing hard at the bottom. Pain shot through his leg, but he forced himself to stand, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He was in the basement now, the darkest, most dangerous part of the asylum. The air was thick with the stench of rot and decay, and the walls were covered in mold and mildew. He limped forward, his flashlight flickering as he moved. The basement was a maze of narrow corridors and small, windowless rooms, each one filled with the remnants of the asylum's dark history. Rusted medical equipment, old patient files, and broken furniture littered the floor, and the walls were covered in graffiti and strange symbols. As he turned a corner, he froze. Ahead of him, in the darkness, was a figure, a tall, shadowy figure that seemed to be watching him. Hayes's heart skipped a beat, and he raised his flashlight, but the figure was gone. He could hear the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps, coming from all around him. He wasn't alone down here. Hayes moved as quickly as he could, his injured legs slowing him down. The footsteps followed him, getting closer and closer, until they were right behind him. He could feel a cold breath on the back of his neck, and he turned, expecting to see the figure standing right behind him. But there was nothing there. Just as he was about to move again, he heard a sound that made his blood run cold. A child's laughter echoing through the darkness. It was a sound that didn't belong in this place, a sound that shouldn't exist. He turned and ran, his heart pounding in his chest, the sound of the laughter following him through the halls. He stumbled into a small room and slammed the door shut behind him. his breath coming in ragged gasps. The room was pitch black, the only light coming from his flickering flashlight. He could hear the sound of the footsteps outside. Hayes stood with his back against the door, trying to steady his breath. The footsteps outside the room had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that felt even more unsettling. He glanced around the small room, the beam of his flashlight revealing dusty shelves and old medical equipment covered in cobwebs. The stench of decay was overwhelming, but something else hung in the air, something he couldn't quite place, like the faint scent of burning wood. The child's laughter echoed again, this time coming from within the room itself. Hayes's heart skipped a beat, and he swung the flashlight wildly, searching for the source. The light flickered, and for a brief moment, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The figure of a small child, standing in the corner, staring at him with hollow, dark eyes. Who are you?" Hayes stammered, his voice barely more than a whisper. The child didn't respond. Instead, it began to hum a tune, an old, haunting melody that sent shivers down Hayes's spine. The room seemed to grow colder with each note, the shadows on the walls twisting and writhing as if alive. Hayes took a step forward, but the child vanished, leaving only the echo of its humming behind. Suddenly, the door behind him burst open with a deafening crash, and Hayes was thrown to the ground by an unseen force. His flashlight skittered across the floor, plunging the room into near-total darkness. He scrambled to his feet, his heart racing, and grabbed the light. When he turned it on, the child was gone, but the room felt different, oppressive, suffocating. The walls seemed to close in, the ceiling lowering as if the building itself was trying to crush him. Hayes could hear the faint sound of whispering voices, overlapping and intertwining, growing louder and louder until they were a cacophony of screams. He pressed his hands to his ears, trying to block out the noise, but it only intensified, the voices blending into a single, agonized wail. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the noise stopped. The room was silent once more, save for the sound of Hayes's ragged breathing. He stumbled out of the room, his mind reeling, and found himself back in the basement's main corridor. The air was thick with a foul stench, and the walls were lined with flickering lights that cast long, sinister shadows. He knew he had to keep moving. Something was coming, something that didn't belong in this world. He could feel it in his bones, a creeping dread that gnawed at his sanity. The asylum was alive with a malevolent force, and it was hunting him. As he limped down the corridor, the child's laughter echoed once more, closer this time. Hayes turned a corner and froze. There, at the end of the hall, stood the child again, its eyes black as coal, a twisted smile on its face. It lifted a hand and pointed directly at Hayes. Then, in a voice that was not its own, the child spoke. "You're next." The lights flickered, and the child vanished, leaving Hayes alone in the dark once more. But this time, he wasn't alone. He could feel the presence closing in on him, the shadows deepening, the air growing colder. Something was coming, and there was no escape. Hayes forced himself to move, his mind racing as he tried to process what he had just witnessed. The asylum was playing tricks on him, warping reality in ways that defied logic. But there was no time to dwell on it. The sense of imminent danger was overwhelming, and every instinct screamed at him to run. He limped down the hallway, the pain in his leg intensifying with each step. The flickering lights cast long, eerie shadows that seemed to dance and twist around him, their shapes shifting in ways that defied explanation. The air grew colder, the scent of decay stronger, as if the very walls were rotting from the inside out. Just as Hayes reached a junction in the corridor, he heard it, a low, guttural growl, followed by the sound of something wet and slimy moving across the floor. He stopped, his breath catching in his throat. The noise was coming from the left-hand corridor, growing louder, closer. It was unlike anything he had ever heard, a sound that made his skin crawl and his heart race with terror. Slowly, he turned the flashlight toward the noise. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing a sight that made his blood run cold. Emerging from the shadows was a creature, a nightmarish abomination that defied description. It crawled on all fours, its body twisted and deformed, covered in slick, glistening skin that oozed a black, tar-like substance. Its eyes were empty sockets, its mouth a gaping maw filled with razor-sharp teeth. Hayes stumbled back, his mind reeling with horror. The creature let out a blood-curdling screech and lunged at him, its limbs moving with unnatural speed. Hayes barely had time to react, throwing himself to the side as the creature's claws raked across the floor where he had just been standing. The impact sent him crashing into the wall, pain exploding in his side. He scrambled to his feet, his flashlight flickering as he ran. The creature was right behind him, its guttural growls echoing through the hallway. Hayes's heart pounded in his chest as he sprinted down the corridor, his mind racing with fear and desperation. He could hear the creature's claws scraping against the floor, getting closer and closer. He reached the end of the hallway and threw open a door, slamming it shut behind him just as the creature crashed into it with a bone-shaking thud. The door rattled on its hinges, but it held, for now. Hayes backed away, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his hands shaking uncontrollably. The room he had entered was small and dimly lit, filled with old, rusted medical equipment and piles of yellowed papers. The air was thick with dust, and the walls were covered in strange, unidentifiable symbols, etched into the plaster with something sharp. The creature outside let out another screech, followed by the sound of it scraping at the door, trying to force its way in. Hayes knew he couldn't stay here. The door wouldn't hold forever, and the creature was relentless. He had to find another way out. He scanned the room, his mind racing, and spotted a small, rusted vent in the corner, just large enough to crawl through. Without hesitation, he moved to the vent and pried it open, the metal screeching in protest. Just as he was about to climb inside, the door burst open with a deafening crash, and the creature lunged into the room, its empty eyes fixed on him. Hayes dove into the vent, pulling the cover shut behind him just as the creature's claws slashed at the metal. He could hear it snarling and screeching outside, but the vent held, for now. Crawling through the narrow, claustrophobic space, Hayes could feel the walls closing in on him, the air growing thicker, the darkness more oppressive. He could hear the creature following him, its movements unnaturally fast, its growls echoing through the vent. There was no escape, no way out, but he couldn't stop. He had to keep moving. The vent was narrow and confining, each movement scraping Hayes's shoulders against the rusted metal walls. His breathing echoed in the confined space, shallow and quick, each breath thick with the stench of mold and decay. The creature's snarls reverberated through the metal behind him, growing louder, more frantic. It was coming relentless, and there was no way to know how far he had left to crawl. Ahead, a faint glimmer of light pierced the darkness, offering a flicker of hope. Hayes pushed himself faster, ignoring the sharp pain in his leg and the growing sense of claustrophobia. The light grew stronger, and as he neared the end of the vent, he could see that it opened into a larger space, another room, a potential escape. He reached the end of the vent and kicked the cover out with all his strength. It clattered to the floor below, and Hayes slid out, landing in a heap on the cold, damp concrete. He quickly turned to shove the vent cover back into place, but he wasn't fast enough. The creature's twisted, clawed hand shot out from the darkness, its claws scraping against the edge of the vent. With a surge of adrenaline, Hayes grabbed a nearby piece of rusted metal pipe and swung it at the creature's hand. The impact sent a shockwave through his arms, but it was enough to make the creature recoil with a screech of rage. Hayes slammed the vent cover shut and jammed the pipe through the holes, securing it as best he could. For now, the creature was trapped, but Hayes knew it wouldn't be long before it found another way to reach him. He turned to survey the room he had stumbled into. It was an old, dilapidated operating theater, the walls stained with age and something far more sinister. The overhead lights flickered sporadically, casting erratic shadows across the rusted surgical table in the center of the room. Instruments lay scattered on the floor, long forgotten, their blades dull with rust. As Hayes moved cautiously through the room, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The walls were covered in strange markings, symbols that he recognized. Hayes stood frozen in the middle of the operating theater, his eyes fixated on the grotesque symbols etched into the walls. These were not ordinary markings. They were ancient, primal, and filled with a malevolence that seeped into the air like a poisonous fog. The symbols twisted and turned in ways that defied logic, almost as if they were alive, pulsating with dark energy. He knew these markings from his years of dealing with the paranormal. They were warnings, signs of a malevolent presence, something far worse than the creature that had been chasing him. His heart pounded in his chest as he realized the true horror of what he was dealing with. A skinwalker, an ancient and powerful entity capable of taking on the form of any creature or human it desired. Suddenly, the room grew colder, and the lights flickered once more before plunging the space into darkness. Hayes fumbled for his flashlight, his hands shaking uncontrollably. When he finally managed to turn it on, the beam revealed something that made his blood run cold. Standing at the far end of the room, just beyond the edge of the light, was a figure. Tall and gaunt, its skin was stretched tight over sharp bones, and its eyes glowed with an unnatural light. Its face was human, but twisted into an expression of pure malice, its mouth a gaping maw filled with jagged teeth. The skinwalker took a step forward, its movements unnaturally fluid, almost as if it were gliding across the floor. Hayes stumbled back, his mind racing as he tried to figure out what to do. He had faced countless horrors in his time, but this was something else entirely, something that defied the very laws of nature. The creature spoke, its voice a low, guttural whisper that seemed to resonate from the walls themselves. "You cannot escape me, Victor Hayes," it hissed, its words dripping with venom. "I have been waiting for you, watching you, feeding on your fear." Hayes felt a wave of nausea wash over him as the creature's words echoed in his mind. He knew he was out of his depth, that there was no fighting this thing head-on. But he also knew that if he didn't do something, he would never leave this asylum alive. He backed up until he felt the cold, hard surface of the operating table behind him. Desperate, he grabbed one of the rusted surgical instruments, a long, jagged scalpel, and held it out in front of him like a weapon. The skinwalker laughed, a sound that sent chills down Hayes' spine. "Do you really think that will save you?" it mocked, taking another step closer. "You are mine, Victor Hayes. Your soul, your very essence, will fuel my power." Hayes gripped the scalpel tighter, his knuckles white. He knew he couldn't let this creature win. With a surge of adrenaline, he lunged forward, swinging the scalpel with all his might. The blade connected with the creature's arm, slicing through its flesh like butter. But instead of blood, a thick black ooze poured from the wound, and the creature shrieked in pain, its form flickering and distorting. Hayes didn't wait to see what would happen next. He turned and ran, his heart pounding in his chest as he raced down the hallway, the sound of the creature's agonized screams echoing behind him. But as he ran, the walls around him began to shift and change, the symbols glowing brighter, their power growing stronger. He was not escaping the skinwalker. He was being led deeper into its lair. Hayes' flight through the twisting corridors of the asylum felt like a descent into madness. The walls, once solid, now seemed to bend and warp around him, twisting in ways that defied the laws of physics. He was disoriented, unable to tell if he was moving forward or being led in circles. The air grew colder with each step, his breath visible in the dim light of his flickering flashlight. Just as he thought he could run no further, Hayes stumbled into a large circular room. The walls were lined with mirrors, tall, ancient mirrors that stretched from floor to ceiling. They were covered in a thick layer of dust, their glass cracked and tarnished with age. But even in their state of disrepair, they held an eerie, unnatural quality that sent shivers down his spine. Hayes slowly moved to the center of the room, his eyes scanning the mirrors. Each one seemed to reflect something different. Shadows of movement that shouldn't be there, glimpses of figures that vanished the moment he tried to focus on them. His own reflection, distorted and twisted, stared back at him from every angle, making him feel like he was being watched from all sides. As he stood there, trying to make sense of what he was seeing, one of the mirrors caught his attention. Unlike the others, this one was perfectly clean, its surface smooth and unbroken. But what truly unsettled him was the reflection it showed. It wasn't his own. In the mirror, he saw the operating theater he had just escaped from, but the room was empty, devoid of the horror he had witnessed. The surgical table was clean, the instruments neatly arranged, and standing in the middle of the room was a woman he recognized immediately. It was Emma, his sister. Hayes's heart skipped a beat. Emma had been dead for years, lost to the very horrors he had spent his life hunting. Seeing her now in this place was like a punch to the gut. He took a step closer to the mirror, his hand trembling as he reached out to touch the glass. "Emma," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Is it really you?" The figure in the mirror turned to face him, and Hayes felt a surge of hope. But as she looked at him, her expression twisted into something dark, something malevolent. Her eyes, once filled with warmth, were now black pits of hatred, and her mouth curled into a cruel, twisted smile. "You left me to die, Victor," she hissed, her voice echoing through the room. "You let them take me." Hayes staggered back, his mind reeling. This wasn't his sister. It couldn't be. But the guilt he had carried for years, the memories of that fateful night, came rushing back, overwhelming him. He had tried to save her, had done everything he could, but it hadn't been enough. The other mirrors began to ripple and shift, their surfaces distorting as figures emerged from the glass. They were the faces of the people he had lost over the years, victims of the supernatural, people he had failed to protect. Their eyes were filled with accusation, their mouths twisted into grimaces of pain and rage. "You failed us, Victor," they chanted in unison, their voices a haunting chorus. "You failed us all." Hayes dropped to his knees, his hands clutching his head as the voices grew louder, more insistent. The room seemed to spin around him, the mirrors closing in, their reflections warping into grotesque parodies of the people he had once known. He couldn't escape them, couldn't outrun the guilt and the pain that had haunted him for so long. But as the voices reached a deafening crescendo, something snapped inside Hayes. He had come here to face his demons, to confront the darkness that had taken so much from him. And now, surrounded by the phantoms of his past, he realized that he couldn't let them win. With a surge of determination, Hayes pushed himself to his feet, his gaze fixed on the mirror that showed his sister. "You're not real," he shouted, his voice cutting through the cacophony. "None of this is real." The reflections flickered, their forms wavering as if unsure how to respond. The room seemed to shake, the mirrors cracking and splintering under the force of his words. The voices grew more frantic, more desperate, but Hayes stood his ground, his fists clenched in defiance. "This ends now," he growled, and with all his strength, he picked up a piece of broken glass from the floor and hurled it at the mirror. The glass shattered on impact, and the room was plunged into darkness. The voices stopped abruptly, leaving behind an oppressive silence that pressed in on all sides. Hayes stood there, breathing heavily, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Then, slowly, the darkness began to lift, revealing a new corridor ahead. The mirrors were gone, the phantoms of his past vanquished. But Hayes knew that the true horror was still ahead, waiting for him in the deepest, darkest part of the asylum. Hayes emerged from the corridor, his nerves frayed but his resolve unbroken. The air was thick with the scent of rot and decay, and the darkness seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The walls were no longer solid. They writhed and twisted like living flesh, the symbols etched into them glowing with an otherworldly light. He had reached the heart of the asylum, the place where the darkness was strongest. This was where the skinwalker's power was at its peak, where the very fabric of reality was thin and fragile. Hayes could feel it all around him, the malevolence, the hatred, the hunger. The asylum was no longer just a building. It was a living, breathing entity, and it wanted to consume him. The corridor led to a massive, open chamber, the pit of shadows. The floor was a yawning chasm, a void that seemed to stretch into infinity. The walls were lined with the remains of those who had come before him. Skeletal figures, their bones fused into the stone, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. The air was filled with the sound of whispering voices, a constant, maddening drone that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. At the center of the pit stood an altar, carved from black stone and covered in ancient runes. It pulsed with dark energy, the source of the skinwalker's power. And standing before it, waiting for him, was the creature itself. The skinwalker had taken on a new form, no longer the twisted, deformed figure it had been before, but something far more terrifying. It was tall and lithe, its skin pale and smooth, almost translucent. Its eyes were deep pools of darkness, and its mouth stretched into a wide, unnatural grin. It radiated power, the very air around it crackling with energy. "You've come far, Victor Hayes," the skinwalker said, its voice a chilling whisper that echoed through the chamber. "But this is where it ends. Your soul will be mine." Hayes didn't respond. He knew that words were meaningless here, in this place where the laws of reality had no power. He could feel the weight of the darkness pressing down on him, trying to crush his spirit, but he refused to give in. He had come this far, there was no turning back now. The skinwalker raised its arms, and the shadows around the pit began to writhe and twist, forming into grotesque shapes. Monstrous figures, their bodies distorted and elongated, their faces twisted into expressions of pure hatred. They emerged from the darkness, their movements jerky and unnatural, like marionettes controlled by an unseen force. Hayes felt a surge of fear, but he forced it down, focusing on the altar at the center of the pit. He knew that if he could destroy it, he could sever the skinwalker's connection to this place, weaken its power. But to get there, he would have to fight his way through the horde of shadowy creatures that now surrounded him. With a deep breath, Hayes charged forward, his flashlight in one hand and the scalpel in the other. The creatures lunged at him, their claws slashing through the air, but he was faster, ducking and weaving through their attacks. He swung the scalpel, cutting through the shadows, each strike causing the creatures to dissolve into wisps of smoke. But for every creature he destroyed, two more took its place, rising from the darkness to take their fallen brethren's place. Hayes could feel his strength waning, the exhaustion setting in, but he refused to stop. He fought with everything he had, his mind focused on the altar, the source of the skinwalker's power. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Hayes reached the altar. The skinwalker stood before it, its eyes burning with fury, but Hayes didn't hesitate. He raised the scalpel and plunged it into the altar, driving the blade deep into the stone. The chamber erupted with a blinding light, and the skinwalker let out a piercing scream, its form flickering and distorting. The shadows around them writhed in agony, their shapes dissolving into nothingness as the altar cracked and shattered. Hayes stumbled back, his vision blurred by the intense light. He could feel the ground shaking beneath him, the walls of the chamber collapsing as the skinwalker's power was ripped away. The pit below him roared with fury, but he knew that he had won, that the creature's hold on this place was broken. As the chamber crumbled around him, Hayes felt a strange sense of peace. The voices were gone, the darkness receding, leaving behind only silence. He closed his eyes, allowing the light to wash over him, and for the first time in years, he felt free. Victor Hayes opened his eyes to a hazy twilight world. The blinding light that had filled the chamber was gone, replaced by a soft, diffused glow that seemed to emanate from nowhere and everywhere at once. The oppressive weight of the darkness had lifted, and in its place, there was a strange sense of calm. He slowly sat up, his body aching from the ordeal. The chamber around him was no longer the nightmarish pit of shadows it had been moments before. The walls were solid once more, the skeletal remains gone, and the air was no longer thick with the scent of decay. It was as if the asylum itself had been purged of its evil, cleansed by the destruction of the skinwalker's altar. But something was different. As Hayes looked around, he realized that he was no longer in the heart of Black Ridge Asylum. The room he found himself in was small and nondescript, its walls bare and unadorned. The only light came from a single window, high up on the wall, through which a pale, sickly light filtered in. Hayes pushed himself to his feet, his legs trembling beneath him. His flashlight and scalpel were gone, but he didn't need them anymore. The danger had passed, or so it seemed. But as he moved toward the window, a sense of unease settled over him. Something wasn't right. He reached the window and peered out, expecting to see the familiar, twisted grounds of the asylum. But what he saw instead sent a chill down his spine. The landscape beyond the window was a vast, featureless expanse, stretching out in all directions as far as the eye could see. There were no trees, no buildings, no landmarks of any kind, just an endless gray wasteland. Hayes stepped back, his heart pounding in his chest. This wasn't Black Ridge Asylum, and it wasn't anywhere he recognized. It was as if he had been transported to another world, a place that existed outside of time and space. A soft rustling sound behind him made him spin around. The door to the room had opened, though he hadn't heard it creak. And standing in the doorway was a figure, a tall, gaunt man with hollow eyes and a thin, almost skeletal frame. He wore a tattered suit that looked decades out of fashion, and his skin was pale and ashen, as if he hadn't seen the sun in years. "Victor Hayes," the man said, his voice a dry whisper that sent shivers down Hayes' spine. "You have come far." Hayes stared at the man, his mind racing. He didn't recognize him, but there was something familiar about the way he spoke, the way he moved. It was as if this man had been watching him all along, guiding him to this moment. "Where am I?" Hayes demanded, his voice trembling. "What is this place?" The man smiled, a thin, unsettling grin that didn't reach his eyes. "You are in the space between worlds, Victor. The place where the living and the dead meet, where the boundaries of reality blur. This is the true heart of Black Ridge Asylum, the place where the darkest secrets are kept." Hayes felt a wave of nausea wash over him. The skinwalker, the pit of shadows, the horrors he had faced, they were all leading to this place. But why? What was the purpose of it all? The man stepped forward, his hollow eyes boring into Hayes' soul. "You have faced the darkness and survived, Victor. But the battle is not over. The evil that lurked within the asylum has been vanquished, but its influence remains. And now you must make a choice." "A choice?" Hayes echoed, his voice barely a whisper. "What choice?" The man raised a bony hand, and as he did, the walls of the room began to ripple and shift, revealing images of the people Hayes had lost. Emma, his sister, the victims of the supernatural, the faces that had haunted him for so long. They stared back at him, their eyes filled with sorrow and pain. "The choice is simple," the man said. "You can return to the world you know, to continue your fight against the darkness. Or you can stay here, in the space between worlds, and find peace. But know this, if you choose to return, you will never find rest. The darkness will follow you, haunt you, until the end of your days." Hayes felt tears welling up in his eyes as he looked at the faces of the people he had lost. He had spent his life fighting the supernatural, driven by guilt and a desire to protect others from the horrors he had witnessed. But now, standing on the precipice of this strange, otherworldly place, he realized how tired he was, tired of the fight, tired of the pain. But he couldn't give up. Not yet. With a deep breath, Hayes made his decision. "I choose to return," he said, his voice steady despite the fear that gnawed at his insides. "There's still work to be done." The man nodded, his expression unreadable. "So be it, Victor Hayes. But remember, this place will always be here, waiting for you. When you are ready to rest, it will welcome you with open arms." With that, the room began to fade, the walls dissolving into mist. Hayes felt a pull, a tugging sensation that grew stronger with each passing second. The last thing he saw before the world around him vanished completely was the man's hollow eyes, watching him with a mixture of pity and something else, something darker. And then everything went black. When Hayes opened his eyes again, he was lying on the cold, hard floor of Black Ridge Asylum. The air was thick with the familiar scent of decay, and the distant sound of dripping water echoed through the empty halls. He was back in the real world, but it felt different, hollow, empty. The fight wasn't over, and Hayes knew he had a long road ahead of him. But for now, he was alive, and that was enough. With a heavy sigh, he pushed himself to his feet and began the long, lonely walk back to the surface, back to the world of the living, where the darkness waited to reclaim him.